people gradually become unable to fulfill their traditional roles in the family. Security about the future is lost, as is often peace of mind. So people are often continually examining their own actions, for example, whether they should or should not have a family. And that also is reflected in loss of potential for relationships and family. There are the virtual deaths of some family members as they become less and less able to contribute to family life, and then of course actual deaths as well. I just want to turn now to some of the losses associated with genetic testing, which concerns all of us. And looking at literature related to the outcomes of positive test results, that is, where a mutation is found, and the outcomes of negative tests, where the person is told that they are clear of the condition. Some of the literature talks about psychosocial death after a positive test result. And I imagine that this is actually much more acute in those conditions where there is a neurodegeneration involved in the condition, like Huntington disease, early onset Alzheimer, the other neurological conditions, where the relationships in the family change. What was striking to me when I was looking at this literature was that the relationships in the family can change almost immediately after the test result is known. So rather than it being related to the physical and mental changes in the affected person, for the family, that psychosocial death might start fairly immediately. And that was reflected in stories related to the condition Huntington disease, where family members were talking about the fact that as soon as they knew that someone was going to be affected in the future, they stopped depending upon that person, and so the person lost their place in a way in the family. And that was partly due to, I guess, not wanting to burden them with any more than they had. But also seeing that they wouldn't be able to rely upon them in the future, and so starting to withdraw that dependence straight away. Of course, associated with a positive test result is loss of uncertainty, but it's only loss of uncertainty in one area, and of course the person is not then certain when the signs and symptoms of the condition will start, whether it's neurological condition or one of the familial cancer syndromes. And so hypervigilance might follow a positive test result. And some work that I did with Bev Solchak in Plymouth on families at risk of Huntington disease indicated very much that being certain was helpful, but then you became very aware of every possible sign and symptom. And there was also some people who expressed an inability, a regret at their inability to be a carer for their parents in the future. So they had lost that ability to think about themselves as someone who would provide support for other people in the family. Ray seems to have...
Just so that they're keeping up to track.
Have you
with
picked?
No, but just
okay.
to let people know.
Ray's just telling me we're moving to slide number 11, so if you're keeping track with this on your own screen, we're up to slide 11 now. For those of you who might have just joined, we're not able to show the slides because we've got a technical problem ourselves, but you can look at the slides as I'm speaking by clicking on the slide icon that's below my head on the screen. Moving now to the outcomes of negative test results, and I guess in the early years of genetic predictive testing, we were a little bit naive about how people would respond to a negative test, as I think still many individuals in families are, thinking that it will be something that is the cause of overwhelming joy. And while there is joy, there are other less acceptable outcomes from a negative test result. And some people have talked about their loss of belonging to the family. And while there was a common threat, while everyone together was facing this disease, whatever it is in that family, the family was cohesive. But once the threat is removed for one or more people, then that cohesion falls apart. And there's a very excellent paper by Sobel and Cohen, 2003, and the references are all at the end of this of the set of slides that I really refer you to, because they talk about this threat, this loss of threat, the disconnection, even potentially resulting in suicide or suicide attempts, because the feelings of disconnection are so profound. There may be mental health problems that ensue after a negative test result because of delayed grief. And it's certainly my experience that some people have put off giving attention to other losses or other traumatic events in their lifetime, focusing instead on the threat of Huntington disease. And when that threat's removed, then they have to face those things. And certainly two individuals who had a good Huntington's test result that I knew needed to have extensive psychiatric support afterwards. One, because she started to relive some traumatic events from her childhood that had been repressed or not attended to, and the other one for similar reasons connected with her memories of her affected father. Obviously, people who get a good test result may mourn for the lost opportunities they had, and one of the women that I knew said after she got her good test result, I just keep thinking that I've got a drawer full of engagement rings. And while she didn't have a drawer full, she had several, and she'd had a number of very meaningful relationships that she'd called off because she didn't want her future husband to care for someone with Huntington disease. And other people have talked about losing their specialness, that while they were at risk for breast and ovarian cancer or other conditions, they were special amongst their friends, amongst their family, but they lost that specialness when they got their good test result. And I think all this really strongly indicates the amount of support we have to offer to people who have a good result as well as what might be termed a bad one. We're now on slide 12, but I just want to read you something written by Lydia, who was a client of our service, and her son David had X-linked adrenoleukodystrophy, a degenerative condition that comes on in childhood. It is an X-linked condition, and Lydia was found to be a carrier. And she writes, "We were told David had a genetic disease. We'd never heard of it, but the neurologist said it wasn't good. I asked him exactly what would happen, and he said, 'Do you really want to know?' He gave us a pile of literature, and he told us there was no cure. We came home, and I can't find words to describe how we felt. We couldn't sit and cry in front of our child, who was thinking, 'The doctors will make me better.' When we read the literature, it was a journey into hell. I felt sick with fear reading of the devastating things that were going to happen to my beautiful child. How could we tell him? We couldn't. The extreme hurt was knowing I had passed it on, and yet I was perfectly healthy. I would have swapped places if it was possible, but that's not life, is it? Life was never to be the same for anyone in our family. Sometimes I feel I'm just living a lie, pretending to be all right 24 hours a day, trying to make life normal for everyone else. I know every mother thinks her child is special, and she should, but something tells me I have someone very special here, and every day I'm privileged and pleased to care for him. I think I feel I've got to be the one to do most things because of the nagging guilt in the back of my mind. One day I'll have to explain to my other son how this happened. How will he react knowing that Mum passed it on? Perhaps it sounds stupid, but you don't know how you feel unless you're in my position. They say you're only given what you can cope with. Mothers are expected to be strong, and we do the best we can. But life is so cruel. I can't think of any better way than Lydia has done to express the grief and loss that's involved in having a child and being who's affected and being a carrier yourself. And she brings in lots of other emotions besides the grief, the guilt that she feels, her own self-blame, and sadness. Thinking about that brings me to some work that I saw when I was doing some research for this presentation by Docker, written in 2002, talking about disenfranchised grief. And it relates, I think, a lot to Lydia's story because the author talks about the grief that goes along with having a child who's affected with learning disability or another degenerative genetic condition. And there's discussion about this disenfranchised grief, which is defined as loss that's not appropriately legitimised by society or by the person's community, where there's support absent. And other work by Todd looks at the enormity of the loss of a child with learning disabilities, but the fact that other people around the parents might simply regard that as a freedom from the burden of looking after such a child. I think we see this too in adults who've died after a long illness or where they're considered to be a burden to the family. Todd says that the lack of research into grief around people with learning disabilities actually conveys a message about the value of those children or adults in our society, and I think that's something that we could seriously think about. And also says that while there is a lot of support for the family while the child or adult's alive, the support is always withdrawn too quickly for the family's benefit. And there's one parent in Todd's paper relates the fact that it took months to get some aids for the child to, I think in the bathroom from memory, but within a couple of weeks of that person's death, the social services were asking for that equipment back, and it just seemed very ironic to the family. We're now on slide 14 and talking more about disenfranchised grief. Fanos and McIntosh make some recommendations about how we as professionals should speak with parents when a child's been diagnosed with a terminal condition, and they say that we should give hope for the future to the parents, but actually parents who have such diagnosis need to grieve. And it made me wonder when I was reading this about whether there's a conflict there, and if we continually express this hope for the future, do we deny the parents' grief? I found a really interesting paper by I think Rama Trustek and Tigson, not sure if I've said that right, but they actually are talking about parents who have a child, a fetus diagnosed with a terminal condition in utero, and talk about setting up a perinatal hospice so that parents who are aware that they're going to lose their child either during pregnancy or if they became aware very shortly after the birth, should have the opportunity to go somewhere where they're supported during that period of the child's illness and death and afterwards. Just want to move now to some thoughts about secrecy in families. Kathy Peters in the US wrote a paper about Marfan syndrome and suggested that the secrecy in families was connected with avoiding stigma that they inevitably felt their children were exposed to if their condition was known. But also some work of my own says that people keep secrets to protect their own children from worry about a genetic condition. But Rowland says that members of the family who know the secret live with anticipatory loss, another form of grief, and they cannot share that. They can't seek any support for that because they're putting so much energy into keeping this quiet. There's also evidence, though, that members of families where the disease is kept secret are actually at higher risk of mental health problems, even suicide, and that's certainly evident in some families with Huntington disease. It makes sense if you can't share your worries and anxieties that you may have more mental health problems. We're now on slide 16. And there was work by Spice et al. In 2002, and this is looking at breast and ovarian cancer families, and talked about a mother who said that she didn't really want to worry her children about the risks, and so that isolated her because she was too scared to talk to friends or even other relatives about the condition in case it accidentally was revealed to the children, so she was very isolated because of that. And Janet Williams has done a lot of work on Huntington disease, of course, in the States, and found that in focus groups of people, spouses of people who had preclinical changes of HD, the secrecy that they felt that they had to keep and protecting perhaps their spouse's privacy meant that they found it difficult to cope with the preclinical changes, and again were not able to access support in the way that might have been helpful to them. I know Janet's actually in the chat room, so she might want to comment on that later. So turning now to guilt. Lots of reasons for feeling guilty, it seems, if you're in a family with a genetic condition, and one of the main ones is being the survivor, relating back to this having a negative test result or getting to the age where you know that you won't get the condition. Actually, survivor guilt is a very real concept and affects people quite profoundly. We should bear this in mind when we're giving good test results as well. Guilt at causing distress to other members of the family because of your illness or your condition. There's evidence that people feel guilty if they need respite, if they're the carer for someone in the family and they have to but feel the need for respite, then that's not done without guilt. And again, some of Janet's work has shown that even when the carer is very, very unwell or on a much needed break, that their main concern is how is the affected person in the family doing, and are they missing some care and feeling guilty about that. And parents in the paper by Todd felt guilty at not being there to save their children or not being able to save their children when they died. Slide 18. There's guilt about having passed on the condition or the risk of the condition. That's not surprising, I guess, but that's actually been shown by some authors to be worse if the carrier is a carrier of an X-linked condition, mainly mothers, as we heard in Lydia's story. But it's not confined to mothers, and men in BRCA families, breast cancer families, also revealed that they felt guilty in passing on the gene mutation to their family members. Now moving to joy, and I realised after I'd set the title that I should have added humour to this, because of course people who are living with a genetic condition in the family often deal with their situations using humour, sometimes very black humour, but they also have many periods of joy or causes for joy as well. And there is literature that shows that families feel that they're actually better family, a closer family, because of the common threat that they face, that they value life more because they've had this threat. There's some work I found by Goodship in 1987 who said, and this was concerning families with a child with Rett syndrome, that having gone through this might make the family more sympathetic to others, and that was a good thing. And I struggle a little bit about that because of the way it was phrased, and it might be a good outcome, but I'd like your comments on what you think about that. And Todd talks about being able to give back to society, and cites one mother who lost her child with a learning disability and went to work in a school for children with learning disability because she felt that her understanding was going to be very helpful in that context. She felt, from memory, that it was like giving back what her child had given to her, which she felt was very, very valuable. Just want to read you now some excerpts from a story that was written by Marcia. And Marcia was at risk for Huntington disease, but as you can see, she dealt with it using quite a lot of humour. And Marcia wrote, "I'm 39 years old and I've lived with the knowledge of Huntington's for approximately 4 years, 7 months, 3 weeks and 5.5 days since my mother was diagnosed." In Marcia's case, her mother's diagnosis came as a complete surprise to the family. They hadn't known about the risk. "No doubt, like many others in this situation, I felt that my world fell apart. I suffered all the usual emotions: despair, helplessness, anger, guilt, isolation and frustration. In my more depressed moments, I exhibit every known symptom of Huntington's and a few more besides. It's difficult to lead a normal life when you're at risk. Everything dropped, spilled or forgotten meets with a sharp intake of breath, followed by a pregnant silence in which everyone in the room thinks, 'Is this it?' Well, that's how it feels to me anyway, and I never imagine for a second that I haven't got it, but more along the lines of, how soon can I give up work, or will I still be able to eat spaghetti? Though I've toyed with the idea of going with the test, I do not feel able at the moment to cope with the possibility of a positive result, and as for a negative result, well, I wouldn't believe that anyway. My son, who's 17, feels that a positive result would be a cue to get on and enjoy the rest of my life. Brilliant philosophy, really. But for a natural depressive like me, who's been practicing the art of depression for 39 years, enjoyment certainly doesn't include getting up for work on a winter's morning, dieting, economizing, or even staying remotely sober. Perhaps when I'm 94, I shall feel differently about the test, but at the moment, I'm just going to take each day as it comes." I'm just going to move on now to some discussion about the way that having a genetic condition in the family causes discordance in families. And some of the reasons for that might be that there is a lot of anger that's suppressed, especially if secrets being kept in the family, and this erupts in arguments over unrelated issues. So people might focus on the trivia really rather than on the big issues. Obviously, we as individuals all have different ways of coping, and sometimes there's a real lack of understanding when another family member copes in a different way to you. There's evidence, particularly in, for example, breast cancer families, that some family members might pressure others to seek information or even to be tested, perhaps without being aware of the impact of that on some people. And there can be skewing of relationships, so that the person who usually parents you becomes childlike, or perhaps your partner becomes like one of the children rather than the person that you rely on for support as well. And the ways in which that we might be able to explain theoretically the way that people cope differently, or why there's discordance, might be in two theories that I know about, which is, one is the need for cognitive closure. The need for cognitive closure is described by Webster and Kriglansky as personal differences in the need for certainty and different levels of comfort with ambiguity. And so we're all on a spectrum, if you like, of need for closure, with some people having a very high need to know what's going to happen in the future, and others having a very low need. So within a family, if, say, you have a high need for closure and you're at risk for breast cancer, you might be prompted to have a test and then maybe have prophylactic surgery, whereas your sister, who has a low need for closure, prefers just to wait and see what happens. There are also, Suzanne Miller talked about in her work about monitors versus blunters. Information may force, if you're a monitor, you seek a lot of information to deal with the threat that you're facing, whereas a blunter is the sort of person who, you might say, puts their head in the sand. But if in the same family information is given to blunters, they might be forced to face a situation prematurely, and this causes a problem. And obviously there's lots of frustration when people close to you aren't coping in the way that you think they ought to be. Thinking about ambiguity, and I use the slide from the Death Valley Health Centre, which I came across when I was in the States a few years ago, to just emphasise and illustrate how ambiguous some of these situations are. But the sources of ambiguity are numerous in genetics. We have ambiguity about someone who has a positive test result, whether they're actually healthy or affected, and they lie somewhere in between those. So how do they consider themselves? And I've already talked about how the other people in the family might also already have started to regard them in some way as affected. We have supportive versus dependent roles, a partner in a family becoming dependent rather than being that source of support that's needed, and so the spouse has to make all of the decisions, and that they talk about that as being very lonely and difficult for them. There's secrecy, trying to keep the family secret versus trying to access support for yourself, and guilt about having passed on a condition where in fact you had no control over that whatsoever. This ambiguity might lead to situations where the person experiences what's called ambiguous loss. And Boss in 1999 wrote about this concept of ambiguous loss and said that it could be present, and I think that he or she was talking about Alzheimer's, and talked about someone being physically present but actually psychologically absent, and that of course occurs in many genetic conditions that involve dementia. But it also could relate, ambiguous loss might also relate to a positive genetic test in an asymptomatic individual, and Sobel and Cohen talk about in the context of breast cancer. With ambiguous loss, there aren't any associated rituals, the normal rituals that we go through when we lose a member of our family, and so the person's not able to express that loss. Often secrecy surrounds the loss. And I saw some material about the situation where someone is physically present but psychologically absent, and conflict about whether, as a carer, you might feel that you want to keep that person alive. Very sad comments about, I worry about when the time comes, will I actually do all I can for someone, or will I just let them slip away because it's actually so difficult for me to care for them? And how do people resolve this ambiguity? They might try and resolve it by changing the nature of their relationship. Partners have talked about trying to actually fall out of love with their spouse so that they could continue to care for them, because it was just so painful for them to continue in a relationship and not be getting the support, love or empathy from the person that they were married to or living with. People might cut off from others who don't share their grief, and this is documented in the case of parents with learning disability, children with learning disability who've lost that child and actually can't bear to spend time with people who can't understand what they're going through. Or people might just try and resolve the issues internally without any support, and that results in mental health difficulties for them. So how can we help as health professionals? Marion McAllister's done some work in this area and says that, part of our work needs to be supporting clients to manage the emotional effects of the genetic condition in the family. And I'd be interested at the end of this presentation to talk about whether that's, whose role that is. Is it the role of a genetic nurse or a genetic counsellor, or is it the primary care team or other people? Increasingly we've got pressure to cut the service, to not give time to just sit talking with people. Is that right, or should it become part of the package? We can encourage families or individuals to discuss family issues, make it actually part of the discussion that we have with them, including talking about the relationships and the family style. Is there secrecy in the family? How could we support people to discuss what's going on with other family members or other supportive people? Celine Lewis, who is working on the Urogentest project, did a big study that was published last year on the sorts of information we give to patients and families in letters and written literature like leaflets, and found that although the families felt that they wanted psychosocial issues addressed, the letters that were sent and leaflets don't provide very much in the form of advice about emotional or psychosocial issues, and that's a really big gap in the services that we give. And Spies et al. Have said that actually, because we don't really want people to think that they're a special case, that they have mental health problems, counselling should be standard with any genetic testing. But I would go further than that and suggest that, it's not just about testing, is it? Many of us are working with families who don't want testing, but nevertheless have to face these issues. To complete my presentation today, I just want to read you a poem that was written by someone I know called Frances, and Frances and her husband had many years ago lost 2 children when they were quite young, in the first couple of years of life, and she came to see me as a genetic counsellor because her nieces were starting to go through a reproductive period, and had asked her to see if she could find out what had made her own children die. She was found to have a chromosome translocation. And Frances wrote this poem after finding that out, when she was already in her 50s. And she called the poem Not Even Me. Everything is so beautiful, but I am not. Everything is so productive, but I am not. Everything reproduces itself, but I cannot. Everything has been made to be so, but I have not. Such beauty makes me sad, as I don't feel part of it. I'm ashamed to be part of a beautiful world. Where can I hide? I've been discovered. Is there a stone I can hide under, like the woodlice or the slugs? No reflected glory for me in children or grandchildren. No bonny bouncing babies, no engagements, no weddings, no careers, no parties, no anniversaries, no celebrations. That is it. There are lots of bits that are beautiful besides a flower. Leaves work so hard. They supply the flowers but rarely get the credit. How many seeds are produced that don't grow into a mature plant? Many animals are food for others. Do the plants that flower or the animals that reproduce appreciate the others and their sacrifices? Will there be fanfares in heaven? Come forward, all the seeds that never had a chance to become plants. Now the animals that were preyed upon by others, all those whose job was scavenging, the animals that were not attractive but had a vital role to do. Like thanks after the college play, no one will be left out. It will be fair. No one will be able to grumble that they didn't have a role. Not even me. We have some discussion points now, and it's going to, they're on slide 30 and 31 of the slide presentation. But just to summarise those, are you aware of any other areas of ambiguity in living with a genetic condition that you've become aware of through your work or through your own experience? And should psychological support be part of the package of care from genetic services or be provided in primary care or from other health professionals? Do you think families in your own geographical area have access to adequate psychological support? And I suppose this is, a lot of people will recognise this as my hobby horse, but do you think that counselling skills training is essential for health professionals working in this area, or is it just desirable? Now I'm just going to have a look at some of the comments that you've put up on the board, so there'll just be a break of about 30 seconds while I do that, and then I'll be coming back. But please put your comments to the discussion points or any questions that you have on the chat room, so that not only I but others can answer. You're very free to answer any of the comments that come up from other watchers. Thank you. Back again, and just noticing that Janet has posted a comment about carers, spouses who are caring, or spouses of someone who has had a positive gene test, finding that they couldn't access support from the natural people, the people around them, because they had made a promise to keep the secret, and they may have promised, I guess, their partner that they wouldn't talk about it, and that it is understandable that the partner might not want other people knowing, but I guess that puts more onus upon health professionals to provide additional support, because these people are more isolated, and that seems to agree with what Janet's says that healthcare providers should be asking the spouses or partners about their own needs, as they might be the only other person who knows that there's been a positive test result. And I'd be really interested, I know some of you who have been watching the presentation have a lot of experience in cancer care. I know that Lisa's out there, and I know that Carrie is out there, and would you, or anyone else who's got experience in cancer, familial cancer, like to comment about whether you think the same sort of thing happens in those families, or is there less secrecy once there's a positive test result? Thanks for your comment, Emma. I'd just like to clarify whether you're talking about predictive tests for neurological conditions, or is that cancer as well, or indeed any other conditions. And I'd also be really interested to hear from some of our colleagues who are working in Europe about whether you think that there is good psychological support offered to families in your own geographical area or region. That would be really useful. I know we've got colleagues from Switzerland and Italy and a few other people. Okay, so Emma has responded that she's talking about mainly Huntington's, so we're still waiting for some information about the familial cancer families. As I said earlier, please don't worry about spelling or anything else. We're just really keen to hear from you via the chat room if you've got a comment to make. When you see me looking over to my right, it's because that's where the screen is with the chat room comments on, so that's what I'm reading when I'm looking over there. And I just noticed we have a comment from Maggie Kirk, whom many of you will know, and Maggie's writing that counselling skills and psychosocial support are integral to this work, but also is some specialist knowledge of genetics in these particular areas. And I suppose that somewhat answers my question about who should be providing this sort of support. It seems as though often specialist genetics services don't have the capacity, but maybe people in primary care don't have that specialist knowledge of genetics or counselling training. Anne Murphy has written from Geneva, saying that in her oncogenetic clinic that they're able to offer telephone support, but perhaps not much more than that, not face to face. Is that right, Anne? And are you talking post-test or outside of the testing issue? Thanks, Maggie, for your comment about to clarify about the training issue. And Lisa Jeffers, who's a very experienced cancer genetic counsellor, is made a comment that she thinks there's generally less secrecy in cancer, but it does still happen, and it's only the needs of the spouse or other family members are addressed if they actually come along to clinic, and that's well understood actually, because you can't give a service to someone who's not in front of you. But I guess it's talking with those family members about how they're discussing it at home, which is important as well. And sometimes just giving, offering support if they do want to disclose can be enough to help them. My own experience is that this often takes many years for people to start to talk more openly about conditions in the family, but by not pressuring them, ensuring that they know it's entirely their own choice, but staying alongside them and giving them support over the years gradually enables them to be able to disclose to and seek advice or support from other family members. And I'm aware that in the UK, because we've got a national health service, that's probably more possible for us than it might be in a insurance-related system. And if you'd like to make a comment on that, that would be useful. So Viviane Sinner from Lausanne has said that psychological care is not commonly provided, but we try to offer support through colleagues who work in the same hospital, but it's not always accepted. And I guess that relates to the comment that, you know, if you package it in with testing or the genetic counselling service, people are more accepting of it than if you say you want to refer them to a psychologist or a counsellor specifically. And Maggie's come back saying counselling and psychosocial support are part of every nurse's business and every counsellor's business too, I'd say. But we need to recognise the boundaries where specialist knowledge is needed. We're rapidly approaching 4 p.m. in the UK, and so we're going to be closing fairly soon. At the end of the slide presentation, you'll find my email address, and if anyone's unable to download the presentation but wants the references, then just email me and I will send you those references and resources.
We've got 3 comments just coming in.
Okay, 3 late comments. Aoife Bradley has given a comment about not pressurising people, but offering it as part of the care, and rehearsing how you will tell, how they will tell the family can be useful. And I totally agree with that, Aoife. That's often really, really helpful. And Milena has said other situations with ambiguity, 25% at-risk person when one of the parents keeps the secret. Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And Rebecca's given a very interesting comment about loss and grief being important, but positive psychology is equally important. Focusing on what can be learned and gained is helpful, but often overlooked, and I agree with that too. And thank you, Anne Cashin, for your final comment as well. Issues of psychological support. Anne works in the United States, so they have struggle as well. I think that we're going to close the presentation now, and I just want to thank every one of you for listening to the presentation and for your comments and contributions, and I'd be very happy to hear from you following the presentation if there's anything you want to take up with me. Thank you and goodbye.